My name is David Long. I am from Rochester Institute of Technology, and along with my co-chair for these sessions, Sally Hattori from Fox, we want to welcome you. This is the third and final Better Pixels session. We're going to focus this afternoon on image processing for Better Pixels. And we have talks today on live HDR production, also on, again, another theme of 3D LUT image quality assessment, and variable frame rate playback technology. So it's going to be a good set of papers to take us to the end of the day. Our first speaker is Andrew Cotton, who is going to talk about Scenelight conversions, the key to enabling live HDR production. Andrew is a principal technologist within BBC R&D's Broadcast and Connected Systems section. He has a background in video compression and image processing. Most recently, his work is focused on high dynamic range TV, as Andrew is one of the developers of the hybrid log gamma HDR system. Everyone, please welcome Andrew.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon. So as David said, I'm going to talk about scene light conversions as opposed to the more usual display light conversions, and explain how those scene light conversions are the key to enabling live HDR production. I'm going to kick off by giving an overview of live TV production and some of the difficulties that we face when migrating to wide color gamut HDR production. I'm then going to talk about the differences between displayed light and scene light conversions, and explain how scene light conversion brings some real advantages for live production. And then I'm going to give some real-world examples of how these scene light conversions have been trialed over the summer. Live TV requires a wide range of cameras and sources. 40 cameras are common at sporting events, and bigger events will often have very many more. We include in that very often a wide range of specialist cameras. So we've got cameras in the corner of football nets, slow motion cameras. In the UK, we even bury cameras in cricket stumps. And they're miniature cameras. And there's going to be very many years until those specialist cameras are HDR. So they're going to be SDR for very many years to come. And so we're going to be intermixing SDR and wide color gamut HDR cameras for these live productions. And you know, if we're going to deliver the very best experience to our audiences, good color matching between those SDR BT709 cameras and wide color gamut HDR cameras is essential. I noticed the ticker's not going, so does that mean I can talk for as long as I like? Typically, however, HDR conversions and SDR conversions are designed to maintain the artistic intent. They aim to preserve the original displayed look of content when it's converted from the original format to the new format. And that's exactly what you want for graded content. If you did anything else, the colorist would be horrified. But I'm going to explain why that type of conversion doesn't really work for live TV, and how these scene light conversions are really the key to enabling live HDR production workflows. To kick it off, it's important that we all understand the terminology. So I'm going to start off with a very basic TV chain, which I'm sure you all understand. We have a camera on the left and a display on the right. And the job of the camera is to collect the light from the scene, focus that through the lens onto the camera sensor, and that, at least in theory, produces 3 linear light signals with red, green, and blue, and they're passed through the camera OETF, the optoelectrical transfer function, to give us nonlinear R prime, G prime, green prime signals, maybe 10 bits, typically 10 bits in bit depth, and that signal's then fed to an EOTF in the display, the electro-optical transfer function, and the job of that EOTF is to generate red, green, and blue linear displayed light signals to feed to the displayed panel. Important to note that end-to-end, there's actually an opto-optical transfer function. The EOTF isn't the exact inverse of the OETF, and typically that opto-optical transfer function is a gamma law. So the displayed light is proportional to the scene light raised to the power gamma. And that gamma should vary. and it compensates for the changes in the sensitivity of the human visual system to tones as the eye adapts. So for HLG, that gamma is specified for different luminance displays and different viewing environments. And for SDR TV, we're used to that. We have a gamma 2.4 display in a dark production environment and a gamma 2.2 display, typically in a brighter consumer environment. Nothing new. So if we look first at a typical display light conversion, here I'm showing SDR BT709 being converted to an HLG signal. And the first thing you'll do is feed that SDR BT709 signal into a reference EOTF, which is specified by BT1886, typically operating at 100 candelas per meter squared, and that'll give you the SDR displayed light signal. You then need to convert that from BT709 primaries to wide color gamut BT2020 primaries, and that's a simple conversion matrix. You then might want to increase the brightness of that SDR signal so that it's comparable to HDR production brightnesses, so maybe around about 200 candelas per meter squared on average, something like that. And then potentially, you might give the highlights a little boost to give that SDR signal a little bit of sparkle as you're introducing it into your HDR workflow. And that gives you an HDR display light signal. And you then feed that into an inverse EOTF, in this case HLG, to give you that HDR signal that would recreate exactly that HDR displayed light signal that you had in the middle of the conversion. So that type of conversion maintains the artistic intent, and it delivers what it says on the tin. The trouble is, when you're mixing different cameras, the displayed look of every production format is different. And in fact, HLG is unique in that the colors on the screen, the displayed colors, are an exact match of the colors in the scene, the colors, the light falling on the camera sensor. And that's achieved because this end-to-end gamma is applied on the luminance signal rather than on the red, green, and blue components independently. And that's only recently become possible. So all other formats, as I said, apply this gamma on red, green, and blue. And that tends to lead to an increase in color saturation on the displayed signal compared with the scene, but only on certain colors. And it depends on the relative signal levels of the red, green, and blue components. It's actually affected by the linear portion that's specified at the bottom of the camera, OETFs. And it's also dependent on the color primaries and the reference levels specified for each format. Now, it's possible actually to assess or look at those differences using this simple mathematical model. I'm going to take a Macbeth chart, and X-Rite very kindly published the L star, A star, B star information for the different color patches. And you can take that L star, A star, B star data from X-Rite, convert that to XYZ, and then from XYZ, you can convert the signal to red, green, and blue signals in either 709 or 2020 primaries, depending on the format. I'm then going to apply a little bit of gain, which is like the camera iris, to ensure that for each of the production formats, I've got the right signal levels. And then I feed that through the camera OETF and the display EOTF to give me the displayed light signal. And now I'm actually going to analyze that displayed light signal using ICTCP PQ. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm using the PQ variant of ICTCP specified in BT2100 because we're looking at displayed light signals. And also, ICTCP is said to be perceptually uniform and work well for HDR. And those transformations are exactly the ones which are specified in BT2100. If we start off with the ICTCP analysis for HLG, if we look just on a CTCP chromaticity chart, the displayed colors are the same as the scene light colors, so I've only got the blue dots here, not the red triangles. A nice spread of colors across the axes. Interesting to note that actually the two skin tones in the top left, dark skin and light skin, are almost exactly the same color. They're just separated by the intensity, which I'm not showing on this diagram. If we now look at BT709, you can start to see that the displayed light colors in the red triangles are actually somewhat different from the seen light colors in the blue spots, particularly in the red and the moderate red, which is that kind of salmon color just above the red there. Other colors, such as, for instance, the bluish green in the top right, are barely changed at all. The seen light and the displayed light colors are very, very similar. And to give you an idea of how big these differences are, that little ellipse, I reckon, is roughly 10 just noticeable differences. So some of these are really quite big changes in color. We can do the same for BT 2020 SDR and PQ, and actually you'll see that the differences are even greater, particularly in the blues, yellows, and reds. So if I just go back, if you look at the left-hand slide for 2020, that's 709. Going back to 2020, you should see how some of those colors really get an extra push when you move to the wider color gamut. So what does that mean on real images? I'm not going to spend too long on this slide because I think it's probably not going to work on this projector. It's just on the preview monitor, it's almost working. I've got two test cards here, both shot in a studio using a Sony HDC 4300. On the left-hand side, I've got the native HLG output that I've converted to sRGB to go on this slide. And then on the right-hand slide, I've got the BT709 output from that camera. I've actually done a display light conversion to put that into HLG, and then again to sRGB. So we've got similar workflows for each of those images. And you may just see, I can see it on this screen here, I can't see it there. The reds are different, and the moderate red above is different. And you'll have to trust me, if you're wiping between those two images on a switcher and looking on an HDR monitor, the differences are really quite marked. Now, all of those changes, actually, those shifts can be avoided if we do scene light conversions instead. And the reason for that is because it's quite obvious when you think about it. The light falling on the camera sensor, the scene light, is the same for every production format. And scene light conversions work in a very similar way to display light conversions, but instead of using EOTFs, so display EOTFs, we use camera OETFs instead. So here you'll see we've got our SDR BT709 signal. We feed it into an inverse 709 OETF to give us a 709 scene light signal. We then put it through a color matrix transformation to give us 2020 primaries. We then might apply some gain to ensure that we get the BT2408 signal levels that we heard about in the earlier presentations. We might give it some highlight boost, and then we put it into, in this instance, once we've got the HDR scene light, we put that into a BT2100 HLG OETF to give us the HLG signal. So very similar process, it just uses OETFs instead. Now, you're thinking, that's all well and good, but what about colors which are outside the 709 color gamut? And if you're watching a football match, as we heard this morning, there's an awful lot of colors like that. I was surprised. Well, there's a little trick you can do to expand the color gamut that's captured by an SDR camera. And that's actually to use negative light. So you can relax the signal clippers. We've been using EBUR 103 levels, which allows us to take the signals to -5% and +105%. And the chart on the left shows what happens in that case. So in the center triangle, we've got the BT709 color gamut on a U prime V prime chart. The purple is BT2020, and then the blue dashed in the middle is what you can do with -5% limits. And actually on dimmer images, you can move the green primary even more. And that helps deliver a really good match between SDR 709 and HDR cameras. Now, talking about real-world productions, many of you will know that it's common for HDR cameras for live production to offer two outputs, an HDR output and an SDR output. This is a very simplified diagram of how that's achieved. You've got the camera sensor. That'll output the red, green, blue linear scene light signal in wide color gamut. That goes straight into the HDR OETF, in this instance HLG, to give us the HDR output. Diffuse white in HLG, if you follow the recommendations, is about 0.25 when the signal's normalized 0 to 1. Of course, it's closer to 100% in SDR, so you apply a gain of around about 4. You then put that signal through a 2020 to 709 matrix, and you can then very simply apply clippers on the red, green, and blue, and feed that signal into a 709 OETF to give you an SDR 709 output. Very often, people will shade the camera, monitoring the SDR output, and just let the HDR output follow with a fixed gain offset. And you can get some really quite spectacular images if you do that. But then it's quite cumbersome, because you've got to pass your HDR and SDR signals through 2 parallel production chains, 2 vision switches, maybe locks the master at the HDR one slave to the SDR mixer, and then potentially 2 backhaul chains if it's an outside broadcast back to base. But there's a little trick you can apply. And if we just reverse the signal flows from that previous diagram of camera, back at the base in your MCR, you can take your HLG, HDR signal, feed that through an inverse HLG, OETF, to recreate the HDR scene light that would appear in the middle of the camera. You then put it through the same gain as you had in the camera, then the same color matrix transformation from 2020 primaries to 709, apply a clip to make sure your signal's in gamut, and put that signal through the BT709 OETF, and hey presto, you've got an SDR 709 signal out of your HLG that looks almost identical to the SDR that's used to shade the cameras. So you need only produce in HLG HDR in this instance, and then convert back at base and get an SDR signal that's remarkably close to what was used at the OB. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Of course, I showed hard clipping to the 709 color volume. We've got a much bigger color volume. If we start off with HDR wide color gamut, and we're trying to get down to SDR 709. So actually, you might be able to do a little bit better than hard clipping in the camera. You can use tone mapping to carefully compress the highlights in the HDR signal to SDR, but that's well understood. I'm not going to talk about that. What I am going to spend a little time on is talking about managing the color space and compressing your 2020 color signal down to 709. And your working color space here can be critical. The 2 charts here, I've got a U prime, V prime chart, chromaticity chart on the left, and an A star, B star on the right. And those lines are lines of constant hue. And if we've got a signal that's outside 709, we're going to try and desaturate that. As you can see perhaps on the right-hand chart, I've got a blue in the bottom right of the corner. If I'm desaturating that towards white to bring it within the 709 color gamut, it's going to follow that dotted line, which will bring it closer to purple. So you can see you can get hue distortions using either of these working color spaces. And the sort of thing you can see here is showing we've got the original slide on the left, and if you use U prime, V prime, then your reddish oranges tend to go a little bit pink. And similarly, if you're using A star, B star, then your blues in the sky here tend to go a little bit purplish, which is what I showed on that previous slide. We've done quite a lot of tests, and actually we have found that ICTCP, which was developed by Dolby and standardized in ITR BT 2100, works remarkably well for this type of operation. You might look at this. These are lines of constant hue from the Dolby paper. And you might look at this and say, well, that's all well and good, but look how wobbly they are around skin tones. And that was my first thought, and you don't want to touch skin tones. Well, actually, skin tones are conveniently within the BT709 color volume. So you don't need to touch the skin tones at all. So outside of that, we found ICTCP to work remarkably well. We've tested 2020 to 709 conversions on a lot of content from the BBC's Planet Earth 2 and Blue Planet 2 HDR series, and not really seen any hue shifts at all. There's clearly some desaturation of colors, but that's really unavoidable. So, how can I be so confident that these Scenelight conversions work so well? That's because actually we've trialed them over a number of events of the summer. The first was the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, which was a joint production between the BBC and Sky. Even though we weren't able to transmit the royal wedding in HLG, HDR, both the BBC and Sky were keen that we should record it in the highest possible quality. So we worked together to ensure that was possible. The BBC had two UHD HDR production trucks, one covering inside of the chapel and the other Windsor Great Castle, and then there was a third presentation truck. BT709 HD had to be the primary output, and the HDR mustn't affect that in any way whatsoever. So we adopted the parallel workflow that I discussed. The cameras were shaded in SDR, and the HDR just allowed to follow. The BBC had 76 UHD HDR cameras. 72 of them had these dual outputs. The radio cameras were operating just in HLG HDR, and we then did a Scenelight conversion from that to SDR BT709 to allow those cameras to be shaded. Well, at least the iris adjusted. There's not much you can do on a radio camera. So they had the same, effectively the same workflow. The switcher, UHD switcher, was slave to the HD SDR switcher. A nice feature was that the program and preview monitors in the trucks, which commonly are consumer TVs these days, were actually fed the HLG HDR signal. So the program directors saw the very best picture quality, which they appreciated. And although in the UK, the BBC took the parallel SDR feed for our transmissions, the world feed went through a Scenelight conversion from HLG HDR down to SDR, and that was used to be intercut with SDR cameras, particularly for Sky, who are covering Windsor Great Park. And it was important there that they got a very good match between their SDR cameras and the converted HLG HDR signal. And if you were watching the royal wedding outside of the UK, and an estimated 1.9 billion viewers were, then actually you were watching that HLG to 709 converted feed. I won't go through this in the paper. You'll be able to see details of the architecture. Our first public trial was the BBC part of the FIFA World Cup. We had two locations for the BBC operation. The first was in the International Broadcasting Centre, which was in a shopping mall on the outside of Moscow. My colleague Simon Thompson was there. And the BBC studio was actually, like many other broadcasters, on Red Square. We made extensive use of augmented reality, and actually about half that set is real and the other half not real. What is real is the view through the window, actually, but there are joins in there which even I can't spot. By the time FIFA announced the availability of the UHD HDR feed, we'd already made a great deal of progress designing our infrastructure. So the studio was already specified as HD only. There wasn't anything we could do about that. The BBC's output, which we streamed on our OTT service, had to be BT2100 HLG. So actually we did a Scenelight conversion from the S-Log3 that HBS used to produce the World Cup to BT2100 HLG, and that worked very well for us. Again, 709 was primary. The studio production was constrained to SDR largely because of the augmented reality, which we only had available in HD SDR. Where practical, we upgraded the studio facilities to 1080p as opposed to 1080i, because that then gave us a much better up conversion to 2160p for the UHD. And we used Scenelight conversions to match that studio feed, which was not only studio cameras but contained halftime replays, to the main match coverage, which was then in our facility HLG. Interestingly, in this instance, we actually used display light conversions for the SDR graphics into the HDR because we wanted to maintain the color branding of FIFA. So that was important there. More details in the paper. We then went on and covered center court at the Wimbledon Tennis Championships. The workflow there was similar to the Royal Wedding and FIFA World Cup, and actually it was the same OB company, NEP UK, who did the Royal Wedding and Wimbledon. There were, in that instance, 38 cameras on center court, but they were a real mixture of HDR and SDR specialist cameras. So scene light conversions with a little highlight boost were used for those SDR cameras. But we had a little problem. Center court at Wimbledon, actually the grass is slightly blue, and that blue is outside the 709 color gamut, but well within the 2020 HDR color gamut. So in order to ensure that we got a good color match with blue grass on both sets of cameras, we relaxed the clippers, and it worked really well. And we got a really good color match between the two. In this instance, graphics used a scene light conversion, SDR graphics, because we needed to match in-vision signage. And the studio was very similar to the World Cup. Now a quick plug, a fourth event. The EBU shot the European Athletics Championships over the summer in HLG HDR with high frame rate, and we supported that. And there's going to be a paper with more details on that by my colleagues Frans de Jong and Dagmar Driesnack on Thursday. So I really recommend you go along to that session on Thursday afternoon. And that's it. So in summary, scene light conversions solve very many of the color matching problems that you encounter in live HDR production. In up conversion, or inverse tone mapping, as it's more correctly called, you can get a really good match between cameras. For down conversion, you can really closely match from the SDR output from a traditional camera. Remember to relax your signal clippers on your SDR 709 cameras. If you're doing color volume processing, then I really recommend that you try ICTCP, which we're finding is working really well. And these simple scene light workflows have now been proven in 4 separate trials over the summer. So we're really quite excited and are hopeful that now those scene light workflows will enable a great deal more live HDR production over the year ahead. And that's it. Thank you very much indeed. And I don't know which counter I'm going by. By this one, we have time for questions, but I'll leave it to you, David.
Hi, Bill Feitner, Colorfront. Quick question. You're referring to doing scene light conversions. So if we have things in display space that requires, we have a knowledge of what the OOTF is getting into the display space. And so that's probably, that's a bit dependent on camera manufacturers. Each one does their own thing, and especially if we go to 709, it's highly dependent upon that, and then also it's highly dependent upon what choices the video controller has made working with the camera. So that's, I agree that getting back to linear scene light is where you should process. We do with everything we do, but doing that unbuild without exact knowledge, you can do a general purpose one and get close. So I just wanted to see what your comments were on that across the broad spectrum of 709 sources. Okay,
so you're right. You need to ensure that the cameras are used in the reference 709 mode. And actually, the vision supervisors we spoke to were quite happy with that. They said, oh, well, sometimes we tweak the gamma. We go with 0.4 instead of 0.45, which is how it's represented on some control units.
But no two cameras have, in other words, we have scene light falling on sensors on camera A and camera B. What comes out in 709, the OOTF is not the same, so there's the one unbuild will not be the same for both. So if you're really trying to get back to scene light, that's the question for you.
So of the 2 types of studio cameras or system cameras we've used, they're both pretty close. Some work better if you approximate the OETF with a square root. Some work better with a strict OETF. So actually, we've got 2 different
But even the
versions.
color primaries, because you have to not only do the grayscale mapping curve, but you also have to have an awareness of what the sensor primaries are, so when you convert back. And that's, some cameras I'm aware of do not have a simple matrix conversion. There's a multi-step to give a better result, so those are a little more complex in the unbuild.
So you can do a multi-step, and on some productions, some vision supervisors will choose to do that.
But I'm just saying is if you're reversing...
But the ones we've worked with actually said, yeah, well, I'm okay. I don't need to do that on this
I mean, if
program.
we look at the cinematic cameras, most of the major ones all publish what they call their IDT, which basically gives us a methodology to get back to Scenelight. But with broadcast cameras, and then of course the less than broadcast cameras, there is no one route unless you have characterized that camera and done some detailed measurements.
So the cameras we've used are pretty accurate. There are some small differences. 3-chip cameras tend to be better in that respect than single sensor cameras. There was a good paper on that at IBC this year. The color match was not perfect, but everybody was happy with it, and the vision supervisors said, hey, that's good enough for me, and that's better than a better match than I can normally get between a Grass Valley camera and a Sony camera.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please tap the like button and also subscribe to our channel to receive notifications when we add new content. For more information about us, please visit SMPTE.org. We'll see you next time.